Welcome to this channel. At the sum of 1,000 subscribers, I will post a series of special stories for you. Subscribe. The rhythmic hum of the ship's engines filled the cockpit as Commander Marcus Thorne stared at the planet below. Cygnus 3, an alien world located in a distant solar system, was a mystery to humanity. It had no record of life forms, yet its jagged landscapes and dense green fog made it impossible to ignore. The crew of the Athena had been sent to survey it, primarily for minerals and resources that could help fuel Earth's ever-expanding need for new colonies. But today, something had changed. "Commander, we're picking up strange readings from the valley ahead," Lieutenant Kayla Vargas reported from her console. Her fingers danced over the controls, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. "It's faint, but consistent, some kind of energy signature. It doesn't match anything in our database." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the data. The pulse was slow but steady, almost like a heartbeat. It was coming from deep within the valley, a place their initial surveys had shown to be desolate. But now, with this unexpected anomaly, they had a reason to investigate. "Prep the ground team," Marcus ordered, standing tall. His voice carried the weight of years spent on missions just like this one. "We'll head down and check it out." As the Athena descended through the planet's thick atmosphere, the view became even more foreboding. Towering black mountains loomed in the distance, their sharp peaks piercing the sky, while the valley below was a sea of emerald mist that swirled in slow, hypnotic patterns. It was eerie, like a world abandoned by time. Marcus, along with a small team of explorers, landed the shuttle in a flat clearing near the valley's entrance. The air was thick and humid, making every breath feel heavy. The sky above was dark, though no stars were visible through the planet's thick atmosphere. The only light came from the faint luminescence of alien plants dotting the landscape, casting an ethereal green glow across the ground. "Stay close," Marcus called out to the team, his hand hovering near his blaster. There had been no signs of hostile creatures on Cygnus 3, but they had learned never to take chances in unfamiliar territory. The pulse grew stronger as they ventured deeper into the valley. Their scanners buzzed with activity, but no one could identify what was causing the strange signal. It seemed to emanate from underground, but there was no technology, no sign of life, just the unnerving, steady beat. "I don't like this," Lieutenant Vargas murmured, her eyes scanning the mist for any signs of movement. "It's too quiet here." Just as she spoke, the mist parted slightly, revealing a large cave mouth hidden among the rocks. A faint light flickered from within, pulsing in sync with the readings from their scanners. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Whatever it is, it's in there," he said, his voice low. "Let's check it out." The team approached the cave cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness inside. The cave walls glistened with moisture, and strange, bioluminescent fungi clung to the stone, casting a dim, eerie glow. The pulse grew louder, more pronounced. Something was waiting for them. At the heart of the cave, they found her. At first glance, she looked almost human, her form curled up on the cold stone floor. But as Marcus approached, he saw the truth. Her skin, pale and translucent, shimmered faintly in the dim light. She was tall, easily 7 feet, but her body was frail, as if she hadn't moved in ages. Her limbs were slender and elongated, her hands curled into fists against her chest. Her face, though alien in its proportions, had an unmistakable sadness etched into it. "Is she alive?" Vargas asked, her voice a whisper. Marcus knelt beside the creature, his heart pounding. He could see the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was breathing. Carefully, he reached out, his hand hovering just above her arm. She was trembling, her body quivering as if she was on the brink of breaking apart. Then, as his fingers brushed her skin, her eyes snapped open. They were large, black, and impossibly deep, like twin pools of ink that reflected no light. For a moment, Marcus froze, expecting her to lash out in fear or aggression. But instead, the alien creature stared at him with a kind of quiet desperation. Her lips trembled, and to his astonishment, tears began to well in her eyes. "She's crying," Vargas gasped from behind him, her voice filled with disbelief. Marcus was paralyzed by the sight. The alien's tears were silvery, almost luminous, dripping down her cheeks in slow, steady streams. There was no sound, just the silent expression of anguish from a creature who had likely been alone for longer than he could imagine. Instinctively, Marcus did the only thing that felt right. He lowered his weapon, knelt down fully, and gently wrapped his arms around her trembling form. The creature stiffened at first, her body taut with fear, but after a moment, she seemed to melt into his embrace. She cried harder, her body racked with silent sobs, as though the weight of centuries of isolation had finally been lifted, if only for a moment. She clung to him, her long fingers gripping his uniform with surprising strength, her tears soaking into his chest. There was no way to communicate with her, no way to ask what had happened or why she was here. But in that moment, none of that mattered. For the first time since landing on Cygnus 3, Marcus didn't feel like an explorer or a soldier. He felt like a protector. "We need to get her back to the ship," he said quietly, looking up at Vargas and the rest of the team. "She's not a threat. She's—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. What could he say? This creature was unlike anything they had ever encountered, yet her pain was universal. It was a loneliness so profound it transcended language, species, or worlds. "She's been alone for too long." Carefully, Marcus lifted the alien creature into his arms. She was light, far lighter than her size suggested, and as he carried her out of the cave, her sobs began to quiet. Her grip on him loosened, though she still held on, as if afraid to let go. As they emerged from the cave, the mist parted around them, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt the weight of her suffering on his shoulders. She was an enigma, a mystery he didn't yet understand, but one thing was certain, she had never known compassion before this moment. And in that moment, as the creature cried silently in his arms, Marcus realized something that sent a shiver down his spine. Whatever she was, wherever she had come from, she had been waiting for someone to find her. Someone to finally show her that she wasn't alone. The dim hum of the ship's interior contrasted sharply with the eerie silence that had filled the valley on Cygnus 3. Inside the Athena, the alien creature lay motionless in the medical bay, her pale, translucent skin now under the harsh white lights of human technology. Commander Marcus Thorne stood by her side, arms crossed, watching as the ship's medic, Dr. Harrow, hovered over her with a scanner. The steady beeping of the medical equipment was the only sound breaking the tension in the room. "She's stable," Dr. Harrow said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Her physiology is complex. Nothing like anything we've seen before. Her organs don't seem to match up with human anatomy at all, but there are enough similarities that I think she's at least partially humanoid." Marcus nodded, though his eyes never left the alien's face. Her eyes were closed now, her long lashes casting delicate shadows on her cheeks. There was a fragility to her, a vulnerability that made her seem less like a specimen and more like someone who had been through unimaginable hardship. "Is she conscious?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. "Barely," Dr. Harrow replied, straightening. "Whatever she's been through, it's drained her. I'm not sure how long she's been like this, but it's clear she's malnourished if that even applies to her species. I'm administering nutrients intravenously, but beyond that, we're in uncharted territory here." Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling a knot of frustration tighten in his chest. They had so little information, and every passing minute felt like another unanswered question. He had brought her aboard to save her, but now that she was here, it felt like she was slipping further away. "Keep monitoring her," Marcus said finally, turning to leave. "Let me know if there's any change." Dr. Harrow nodded, but just as Marcus reached the door, a soft sound stopped him in his tracks. He turned around, his eyes widening as he realized the alien was moving. Her hand twitched slightly, her long, delicate fingers flexing as though testing the sensation of movement. "She's waking up," Harrow said in a hushed tone, stepping closer to the bedside. Marcus moved back to her side, his heart pounding. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing those same deep, dark orbs that had stared at him in the cave. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room. Then her eyes locked onto Marcus, and she froze. "It's okay," Marcus said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe here." Of course, she couldn't understand his words, but there was something in his tone, in his presence, that seemed to calm her. Slowly, she sat up, her movements shaky and uncertain, like someone waking from a long, heavy sleep. Her eyes never left his, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other in silence. Then, as if on instinct, she reached out. Marcus didn't flinch as her hand brushed against his chest, right where his heart was. Her touch was cool, almost cold, but there was a softness to it, a gentleness that contradicted the strength he had seen in her earlier. She pressed her palm against his chest, her dark eyes filled with an unspoken question. "Can you understand me?" Marcus asked quietly, knowing the answer but hoping for some sign of recognition. The alien's head tilted slightly, her expression one of curiosity, but she didn't speak. Instead, her hand remained where it was, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. There was something intimate about the gesture, something that transcended the vast differences between their species. "Commander, this is incredible," Dr. Harrow murmured, clearly fascinated by the interaction. "She's responding to you. Somehow, you've made a connection." Marcus didn't answer, too focused on the creature in front of him. He didn't know why, but her touch stirred something deep inside him, a sense of empathy, of understanding. He could feel the weight of her isolation, the crushing loneliness that had likely been her only companion for years, maybe centuries. She lowered her hand slowly, her expression softening as she did. Then, to Marcus's surprise, her lips parted, and a faint, almost imperceptible sound escaped her voice. It wasn't a word, not in any language he could understand, but it was something. A low, melodic hum, like the faint whisper of a forgotten song. "She's trying to communicate," Dr. Harrow said excitedly, stepping closer. "Commander, I think she's aware of us. We need to find a way to dash." The alien flinched at Harrow's approach, her body tensing. Her gaze darted to the medic, her eyes wide with a sudden wariness. Instinctively, she leaned closer to Marcus, her hand gripping the fabric of his uniform. Marcus raised a hand to Harrow, signaling him to back off. "Give her space." Reluctantly, Harrow stepped away, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Commander, this is unprecedented. We need to understand what she is, how she survived, what her species is capable of. If we're going to help her dash." "We will," Marcus interrupted firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But right now, she needs trust. Not tests." Harrow hesitated, but after a moment, he nodded. "Of course." As Harrow left the room, Marcus turned his attention back to the alien, who had relaxed once again now that they were alone. She released her grip on his uniform, her fingers tracing the edges of his hand instead, as if trying to comprehend the texture of human skin. Marcus found himself marveling at the simplicity of her gestures. There was something so pure, so innocent about the way she interacted with him. She wasn't a monster or a threat. She was lost. "I'm Marcus," he said softly, knowing she couldn't understand. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to help you." Her large, dark eyes met his again, and for the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition. She might not understand his words, but she understood something far more fundamental, his intent. As the days passed, Marcus spent more and more time in the medical bay. The alien, whom he had started calling Ilara, became more responsive, though she still didn't speak. She followed him with her eyes, watching him with a quiet intensity whenever he was near. Slowly, she began to mimic his gestures, mirroring the way he moved or tilted his head. It was as if she was learning from him, absorbing every bit of information she could. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. While the crew remained distant, unsure of how to approach the creature, Marcus found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. She had become more than just a mystery to solve. She had become important. One evening, as Marcus sat beside her bed, watching her delicate fingers trace the edge of a blanket, she did something that took him completely by surprise. Elara reached out, her hand brushing against his face. Her touch was tentative, as if she wasn't sure if she was allowed. But when Marcus didn't pull away, she let her fingers linger, tracing the line of his jaw with a softness that spoke of curiosity and something else, gratitude. For the first time since he had found her, Elara smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. And it broke something inside Marcus, a dam he hadn't realized he'd built. She was so much more than the alien they had rescued. She was someone who had been waiting for connection, waiting for someone to show her that she wasn't alone in the universe. Marcus found himself smiling back, even as a lump formed in his throat. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, though part of him wasn't sure if that was true. As Elara's hand fell away, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He didn't know who she was, where she had come from, or what she had endured. But he did know one thing. He would do everything in his power to make sure she never felt alone again. Weeks had passed since the Athena first encountered the alien creature now known as Elara, and while the bond between Marcus Thorne and her had deepened, the mystery surrounding her only grew more complex. Every attempt to learn more about her biology, her past, or the technology she carried had yielded frustratingly few results. The United Terran Fleet, growing impatient with the lack of progress, was demanding that Elara be brought back to Earth for further study. But Marcus knew that if she was taken, she would be treated like an experiment, a fate she didn't deserve. Elara had grown stronger, though she remained silent. Her eyes, however, always seemed to hold a story just out of reach, as if she was waiting for the right moment to share it. Her trust in Marcus had solidified, and while she still shied away from most of the crew, she would seek Marcus out, clinging to him with the quiet assurance of someone who had found their anchor in a storm. But something was changing. Elara's glowing skin, once radiant with life, had begun to dim. At first, it was subtle, just a slight reduction in her shimmer, but soon, the light within her seemed to fade like a dying star. She was growing weaker again, and no amount of care or treatment from the medical team could halt it. The urgency of the situation pressed down on Marcus, leaving him torn between orders and the instinct to protect her. One night, as Marcus sat by Elara's side in the dimly lit medical bay, she stirred. Her once luminous skin now flickered faintly, like the last embers of a fire. She opened her eyes, which had grown darker, more distant, and slowly turned her head to look at him. "Elara," Marcus whispered, his heart sinking as he saw her condition worsen. He gently took her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin. "What's happening to you?" For a long moment, there was only silence, the soft hum of the ship's systems filling the room. Then, in a voice so faint he barely caught it, Elara spoke. "Home," she whispered, the word trembling in the air. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was the first time she had spoken anything recognizable, and the word hit him with the force of a revelation. She wasn't just an anomaly on this alien planet, she belonged here. Cygnus 3 wasn't just some desolate world they had stumbled upon. It was her home. "Home?" Marcus repeated, searching her eyes for answers. "Where? Where is it? How do we get you there?" Elara's gaze shifted, filled with both desperation and determination. Slowly, painfully, she raised her hand and pointed toward the observation window, where the jagged mountains of Cygnus 3 stood silhouetted against the dark sky. Her finger trembled, and Marcus followed her gesture. "The valley," Marcus muttered, realization dawning. "It's back where we found you, isn't it?" Elara nodded, the faintest hint of hope flickering in her eyes. Marcus's mind raced. The strange pulse they had detected in the valley, the ancient structure they had barely explored, it all began to make sense. The valley wasn't just where they found her, it was likely tied to her very survival. The pulse they had been detecting was more than just random energy, it had to be connected to Alara's life force, and it was growing weaker along with her. He had to act, and fast. Without hesitation, Marcus stormed out of the medical bay and headed straight for the bridge. His mind was set he needed to return to the valley, regardless of the consequences. But as he approached the command center, the weight of authority pressed down on him. The United Terran Fleet had already issued direct orders to bring Alara back to Earth. His decision to return her to the valley would be seen as defiance, a career-ending move. But none of that mattered now. When Marcus entered the bridge, Lieutenant Kayla Vargas and the rest of the crew were busy monitoring the ship's systems. They looked up in surprise as he strode in, his expression grim. "We need to head back to the valley," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kayla frowned. "Commander, the fleet has already ordered us to prepare for the return trip to Earth. We can't just dash." "We don't have time for that," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "Alara is dying. She needs to return to the valley. It's the only chance she has." Kayla hesitated, exchanging a worried glance with the others. "What makes you think that?" "We barely know what's in that valley." "I don't know for sure," Marcus admitted, "but I know that she's been trying to tell us something. That place, whatever is down there, is connected to her survival. We owe it to her to find out." The room was silent, tension hanging in the air. Marcus could see the doubt in their eyes, the hesitation to go against orders. But he also knew they had seen Alara, felt her pain. This wasn't just another mission. This was something greater. Kayla finally nodded, her jaw clenched. "We're with you, Commander." The Athena shifted course, heading back toward the valley where they had first discovered Alara. As the ship descended, the crew could once again feel the unsettling atmosphere of Cygnus 3 creeping in. The dark mist swirled outside the windows, and the mountains loomed like silent sentinels. Once they landed, Marcus and a small team, along with Alara, disembarked into the valley. Alara was weak, barely able to stand, but she clung to Marcus, her eyes filled with resolve. She guided them toward the cave, where the strange, rhythmic pulse was now barely detectable. Inside, the team discovered what they had missed before: an ancient alien structure, half buried beneath layers of stone and alien growth. The structure hummed with energy, but it was flickering, as if it had been failing for centuries. Its walls were covered in intricate symbols, glowing faintly with the same pale light that had once radiated from Alara's skin. This is incredible," Lieutenant Vargas whispered, running her hands over the symbols. "What is this place?" Alara, leaning heavily on Marcus, reached out and touched the structure. The moment her fingers made contact, the symbols flared to life, and the pulse they had detected before surged with newfound strength. "She's activating it," Marcus breathed, watching in awe. The structure was a life force generator, a technology beyond anything they had ever encountered. It had been designed by Alara's people, long ago, to sustain them in times of great catastrophe. But something had gone wrong. The generator had faltered, and Alara had been left alone, suspended in stasis until the Athena had unwittingly triggered her release. She had awakened too soon, and without the generator at full strength, her body had begun to fail. As Alara poured the last of her energy into the structure, memories flooded Marcus's mind, not his own but hers, a vast, thriving civilization that had once called Cygnus 3 home. A people of light and energy who had created wonders beyond imagining. But their world had been ravaged by a cosmic event, a catastrophe that had wiped them from existence. Alara had been their last hope, the sole survivor left in stasis, waiting for the day her world might be reborn. The generator flared one last time, filling the cave with brilliant light. Marcus shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as he felt the energy pulsing through the air. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. When Marcus looked down, Elara's form was fading too, her body becoming translucent, dissolving into the air like a wisp of smoke. Her dark eyes met his one last time, filled with gratitude and peace. She was never meant to survive alone, Marcus whispered, tears blurring his vision. She was waiting for her people. Elara's form vanished completely, leaving only a soft shimmer in the air, like the fading light of a star. Marcus stood there in silence, feeling the immense weight of her loss. She was gone, but in her final moments, she had revealed the truth of her existence, a being who had survived the death of her world, only to find love and compassion, if only for a fleeting moment. He stayed there long after the others had left the cave, staring at the empty space where Elara had once stood. She was gone, but her memory, the bond they had shared, would remain with him forever. The cave was eerily quiet after the light faded, leaving only the faint hum of the ancient structure. Commander Marcus Thorne stood still, his mind grappling with the emptiness that now filled the space where Elara had been moments ago. The last remnants of her form had vanished into the air, her body dissolved into the energy she had poured into the generator. The team behind him murmured in disbelief, trying to process what they had just witnessed, but Marcus heard none of it. All he could feel was the hollow ache in his chest. Elara was gone. The alien creature who had cried in his arms, who had clung to him as if he were her last lifeline, was no more. Marcus had known this moment was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to feel like this, as though he had lost a piece of himself. He had saved her, in a way, returned her to the place where she belonged. Yet, the loss felt deeper than any victory. Lieutenant Kayla Vargas stepped forward, her face pale in the dim glow of the cave. "Commander," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of awe and sadness. What was she?" Marcus didn't respond at first. His gaze lingered on the stone floor where Elara had stood, the soft shimmer of energy still visible in the air like a faint afterimage. Slowly, he knelt down and placed his hand on the ground, where her presence had once been. The cool stone beneath his palm felt heavy, and he closed his eyes, trying to hold onto the last memory of her touch, of her presence. "She was the last of her kind," Marcus finally said, his voice low and filled with grief. "An entire civilization lost to time, to catastrophe. She was their final hope. Left behind in stasis, waiting for someone to find her, to awaken her." Vargas knelt beside him, her expression softening. "And we did." Marcus nodded. "We did. But she wasn't meant to be alone. That technology, the generator, it was designed to sustain her, to bring her people back when the time was right. But it failed. And she was left waiting for so long. Too long." He stood up, wiping a hand across his face as he gathered himself. The weight of the moment bore down on him, the reality that no matter what they had done, Elara's fate had been sealed long before they arrived on Cygnus 3. She had been a remnant of a world that no longer existed, a ghost of a forgotten civilization. And yet, for the short time they had known her, she had become more than that. "I thought we could save her," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "But in the end, she saved herself." There was a silence between the crew, the gravity of Marcus's words hanging in the air. They had witnessed something beyond their understanding, a tragedy of cosmic proportions wrapped in the form of one fragile creature. And yet, in that tragedy, there had been beauty and undeniable connection between species that transcended the barriers of language, culture, and time. Marcus walked toward the central pillar of the alien structure, his hand brushing the surface where Elara's final energy had been transferred. The symbols on the walls had dimmed once more, the pulse of the generator now a faint, almost imperceptible thrum. Whatever life it had held was now gone, just as Elara was. But the memory of what she had shown him, her people's incredible technology, their resilience, would stay with him forever. "We have to report this to the fleet," Vargas said softly, stepping beside him. "They'll want to know everything." Marcus hesitated. The United Terran Fleet had been insistent that Elara be brought back to Earth. They had viewed her as an anomaly, something to be studied, dissected. But Alara wasn't just an alien to be examined. She had been a sentient being, full of emotion and history. And now that she was gone, Marcus realized the truth: this wasn't a discovery to be exploited. It was a story to be told, a testament to the fragility of life in the universe. "They'll never understand," Marcus replied, his voice distant. "They'll see her as a missed opportunity." But she wasn't an experiment. She wasn't something to be taken apart and studied. She was alive. He turned to Vargas, his eyes sharp. "We'll tell the fleet what we found here, but not everything. Not about her, not the details of what really happened. Let them think she was a lost artifact, part of the planet's ancient history. That's all they need to know." Vargas studied him for a long moment before nodding. She understood. Alara's final moments, her story, belonged to them now, not to the bureaucrats and scientists back on Earth who wouldn't grasp the depth of what had transpired. This was something sacred, something to be honored, not dissected. As they made their way back to the ship, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Alara's face from his mind. The sadness in her eyes, the way she had touched his chest as if to remind herself of the existence of another heartbeat, another being who understood her pain. He had felt a connection to her that went beyond species, beyond the stars. She had been more than just an alien, she had been a companion in the vast loneliness of the cosmos. Back aboard the Athena, Marcus stood in the observation bay, staring out at the jagged mountains of Cygnus III, now bathed in the faint glow of the planet's setting sun. The mist still swirled across the valley below, the dark sky above speckled with distant stars. It was a world full of ancient secrets, lost to time. But there was something peaceful about the view now, a sense of closure that had been absent before. Alara had found her way home, even if that home was no longer the thriving world it had once been. In her final moments, she had returned to the place where her people had existed, to the generator that had once been a beacon of hope for her race. "Goodbye, Alara," Marcus whispered, his voice carried away by the vastness of space. "I hope you found peace." A quiet knock came from behind him. It was Vargas. "We're ready to leave when you are, Commander." Marcus nodded but didn't turn around. "I'll be there in a minute." As Vargas left, Marcus took one last look at the planet below. The loss still ached in his chest, but he knew it was time to move on. Time to carry the memory of Alara forward, even as they left Cygnus III behind. He would never forget her, the alien who had cried in his arms, not because she feared death, but because she had never known love before. And in the end, that love had set her free. With a final glance at the stars, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving the empty planet and its long-forgotten history behind. But the bond he had formed with Alara, however brief, would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the universe, there was still room for connection, for compassion, and for love.